call us, to being a representative of 70,000 people. And that was an overwhelmingly humbling experience. It was intimidating. I didn't know how to be a representative. But I put myself to work, and over the last 5 years, I've been involved in some of the most significant pieces of legislation that we've passed in Utah recently. One of the things that really led me into running, one of the things that kind of convinced me that yes, it's a good idea to dedicate myself to it, was the weak child predator laws we had in this state. I had dealt with people who we would arrest for brutal child crimes and child sex offenses. They would go to prison and be out in 3 years just to do it again. So I was dedicated to changing that. I thought, well, this is an opportunity. If I can get elected, I can change that. So my first term in office, first 2 years in office, I sponsored what is called the Jessica Lunsford Act. The Jessica Lunsford Act is a bill named after a little gal from Florida. And what it did here in the state of Utah is moved us from having essentially the weakest child predator laws in the country to having now some of the strongest in the country. No longer does a child predator serve 3 years in prison and then get out. The minimum mandatory sentence now is 25 years to life on a first offense and life with no possibility of parole on a second offense. I was very proud of that. As a matter of fact, I was standing with Mr. Lunsford, the father of Jessica, on the House floor when we passed that. It was a very emotional experience for everybody. I ran for re-election because there was a series of things that were coming down our way. The housing bubble had burst. There were threats of tax increases. There were threats of government growing, and people were hurting. People were losing their homes. People were out of work. And so I wanted to run for re-election to represent my constituents, and so I did. And I want to just highlight, let me just tell you this, and then I'm going to highlight one more piece of legislation that is very significant because of the date today. If there has been a conservative fight in the state of Utah over the last 5 years, there's a good chance that I was at the head of that fight. It doesn't matter if it was the battle to reclaim our lands here in the state, because if we are able to get control of our lands, that money is supposed to go to the education of our children. It will move us from being the least funded in this country to one of the highest funded if we can just get control of our land. If it's the battle against Obamacare, if it's the battle to keep taxes low, if it was the fight against labor unions who were coming into the state of Utah to try to take away your right to a secret ballot, I was at the forefront of those fights. I want to highlight just one piece of legislation for you that deals with Obamacare. Today is the 2-year anniversary of President Obama signing Obamacare into law. I want to tell you what Utah did and the small part that I played in where we're heading with this fight. In 2010, they were threatening to pass Obamacare. They hadn't done it yet, but they were threatening. Now, I was the founder of an organization called the Patrick Henry Caucus. It was myself and a few of my legislative friends who founded this organization, and it's dedicated to state sovereignty, states upholding their 10th Amendment rights, and becoming co-equals with the federal government. Well, we knew that they were talking about Obamacare and a healthcare takeover, and so I drafted a 4-page piece of legislation. That's all it was, 4 pages long. I worked with the Attorney General's office, I worked with Senator Mike Lee, and we presented this bill. I presented this bill. What it said was 2 things. It just simply said that if Obamacare passes, if they pass the national health care takeover, it would not be recognized in the state of Utah until the legislature had time to approve it. And number 2, no citizen, none of you, would be forced by any government to purchase health care insurance, the individual mandate, or be considered a criminal. Because that's what it does. In 2014, when it takes full effect, you will purchase health care insurance or you'll be considered a criminal. Okay? Well, the Democrats called it a worthless message bill. They said that this bill will do nothing. Congress hasn't even passed a health care takeover yet. This bill is a worthless message bill. As this fight was going on, Congress passes Obamacare. Okay? 26 states file a lawsuit against Obamacare in Florida. We're part of that lawsuit. You've probably heard about this on the news. Immediately, the federal government files a motion to dismiss, and the judge takes that under advisement. They said, the federal government said, there's no state in the nation that had a law in the books, there's no state that has standing in this case because there was no state that had a law in the books preempting Obamacare. The judge took it under advisement. Here's what happened. In the bill that I drafted, we put in it it's an unusual thing, but we put in what's called an immediate effective date clause. And what that means is that if it passes in the House with 2/3, passes in the Senate with 2/3, then as soon as the governor signs it, it's immediate effect. It is a law of the land. Typically, that's not the case. When the governor signs a law, it usually doesn't take effect until the next fiscal year. Okay? What the judge discovered was on March 23rd of 2010, 2 years ago, President Obama signed the health care law into place. On March 22nd, the day before, Governor Herbert signed my bill into law. The judge ruled that Utah had standing. He said that because Utah had standing, all 26 states in the lawsuit have standing. 24 hours is all that separated us from not having standing and having standing. He struck Obamacare down, and it is now, as you well know, in the United States Supreme Court, where next week, Monday, they start oral arguments against Obamacare. Two little flyover states, Idaho and Utah, had laws on the books that carried the day for the rest of the country. When Judge Roger Vinson from Florida came out with his decision, and he actually, in his decision, he quotes from the bill that I drafted. That was a good day. That was a very humbling experience because I had never, you know, I gotta tell you who I am. I'm a family guy. I'm just a regular middle-class blue-collar family guy. And never in my wildest dreams did I ever believe that I would ever be involved in something so significant, so much bigger than myself. And we're going to win. I believe we're going to win with a lot of hard work, a lot of prayer, and some really good attorneys. I believe we're going to win this in the Supreme Court. I'm running for the United States Congress because we stand at a crossroads right now. We stand at a crossroads in this country where we have to make a decision. Are we going to continue down the path that we're going, which is the path of big government, top-down policies, where the federal government thinks they know what is best for you and me, where they think they know what is best for our families? Or are we going to turn the ship around and reclaim really relight the lamp of liberty that our founding fathers envisioned, and turn this ship around fiscally, financially, and quite frankly, ethically and morally? You see, I think the two biggest issues in this country right now, the two biggest issues, I believe it can be narrowed down to two things. And if we could just change these two things, we could change the country. I believe, number one, part of the problem is a continuing decay of the moral fabric of society. And number two is a complete disregard for the United States Constitution as the rule book for our government. If we just change those two things, we could turn this country around. But we are hemorrhaging right now, and we have got to do something to stop the bleeding. So here are my top three proposals. These are my top three issues, and then let's talk about yours. Number one, the first thing I will do when I am elected to Congress, above all else, is I will file and I will run a balanced budget amendment. I want a balanced budget amendment that forces Congress to cap its budget, balance its budget, cut the budget, and requires 2/3 majority vote to raise taxes. I believe and look forward to going back and working with Senator Mike Lee, Senator Hatch, and our other congressmen in passing a balanced budget amendment. This is something that they have been championing for a long time, and I look forward to joining that battle. It is time that we balance our budget in this country. Number two, I want to deregulate. I want to deregulate the lives of individual citizens, businesses, and the states. Every day in this country, business owners, small business owners, and businessmen have to make a decision on whether they're going to stay in this country and go out of business or take their business overseas. That's a decision that no business person, no self-employed person should ever be faced with in this country. It wasn't government regulation. that made America great, it was you. It was the citizens. It was the citizens who came up with ideas, who innovated, who created jobs, created wealth, who lived the American dream and said, you know what? This person built a business and so can I. Here's my idea, and I'm going to pursue that agenda and that idea, and you succeed. We also have the right to fail in this country. That's what I want to return to, is a free market society where businesses flow and can be created. Yes, sir?
What about health and safety issues? You know, like the USDA, things that affect, you know, making sure that food supplies, drug supplies are safe. Does your deregulation include regulation of those of that type?
Well, if you'll hang on one second, that'll be the first question I answer. I want to just hit on my third point, and then I'll come to that. Okay, thank you for that question. Yes, sir.
Just in your deregulation, you talked about the citizens.
Yeah.
You talked about small business. Yeah. What was the third one?
States.
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 I got you.
And that's really my third point. My third point is I would like to return power to the states. James Madison, who is the father, referred to as the father of the Constitution, in Federalist 45, he said, powers delegated to the federal government are to be few and defined. Okay? Well, who believes that what the federal government is doing right now is few and defined? Of course not. Of course not. They're trying to be all things to all people and do all things for all people. That's got to stop. I want to return to where the states have sovereignty and are balanced with the federal government, where we return to where the states are 50 laboratories of innovation, creating and building and networking with one another. Those are my top 3 priorities. I'm going to open it up for questions now, but let me start with a question here about regulation from the top down. There are certain constitutional roles for the federal government. One of those constitutional roles is to regulate interstate commerce. The problem with that is the term regulate interstate commerce has been taken so far out of context, and through court cases, as you and I were talking about earlier, court cases that have completely distorted the term interstate commerce, where the federal government now has the ability to regulate everything. In many cases, matter of fact, I think in most cases, the regulations and the regulatory departments could be pushed down to the state level. There are some things that you can't push down to the state level. Let me just give you one example. Let's talk about agriculture for a second. If there is a river, as there is here in Utah, that is running through 3 or 4 different states, okay, and we have complete state autonomy and regulation, if the state at the top of the river dams the river and wants to use it for hydroelectric, of course our farmers down here go out of business and we all starve to death. So there has to be an arbiter between the states. And that's really what the federal government was intended to be, is to be an arbiter between the states and their regulation, to make things normal. To regulate commerce means to make things regular. And that's the original intent, was to regulate and just make sure that the states were not taking advantage of each other. Personally, I believe that a lot of the regulation can be pushed down to the state level. For things that are imported into the country, there is a federal role for those, and to make sure that there are standards that are set, in my opinion. Sir?
Just generally, what are your plans, basically, to defeat Matheson?
Oh, good. This question always comes, and I have to tell you, it is my favorite question out of all the questions that are asked. And let me tell you why it's my favorite question. The people running in this race, the Republicans running in this race, are my friends. I have so much respect for them.